Hi, I'm John Ficarra. Welcome to Ficarra Classic, and today we're going to talk about my favorite racing series of all time and two of my favorite race cars in that series. Now we're talking about the Can-Am, or the Canadian American Challenge Cup, and the Porsche 91710 and Porsche 91730. And at the end of the video, I've even got some old school footage of Mid-Ohio, the 91710 running, if you stick around long enough. So let's start off with talking about the Can-Am. What the heck is it? Well, it was the closest thing in history, really, up to that point, of a no-rules car racing series. And what I mean by that is that the cars essentially, they had to have a windshield, they had to have four wheels, they had to have a closed bodywork. After that, everything went. So there were no restrictions on engine size, induction, aerodynamics, engine capacity, materials. I mean, these things were made out of titanium. There was one with a whole chassis made of titanium, early carbon fiber. Whatever you could think of went. It was just to make a two-seater sports car as fast as you possibly could. And that's exciting. To anybody a fan of racing or to any engineer working in racing, you want to be a part of that. It started in 1966, and at that point, Lola had a very good two-seater Group 7 sports car. And they won the first year of Can-Am with John Surtees, the only man ever to win the Formula One championship and the Motorcycle World Championship. I don't see that ever happening again unless Lewis Hamilton gets on a motorcycle. I don't see that happening anytime soon. So Lola wins the first year, and then the engineers start really getting into it. They start getting the groove of what they're capable of doing in this series. And I mean, all kinds of amazing teams showed up. There was McLaren, there was Shadow, there was Chaparral, there was BRM, there was March. I mean, everybody kind of came to the table. Ferrari showed up with a couple early cars. Even Porsche showed up with a couple early cars. People wanted to be part of this. And they built some of the most outrageous cars you'll ever see. It was the first time a big wing was used in road racing competition, was on the Chaparrals. Chaparral would come up again with the 2J, also known as the sucker car, which had a snowmobile engine in the back that ran two cooling fans from an M109 self-propelled howitzer that sucked the car to the ground, creating massive downforce, even sitting still. That's the subject of a whole nother video. Shadow came along with basically was a go-kart with a Chevy V8 on it. I mean, we can go on and on about the Can-Am, but I want you to understand what Porsche was walking into. It was the Wild West of car racing, and it was fabulous. The other thing that brought a lot of interest to the racing series was that it had a huge sponsor. Johnson Wax sponsored them as their primary sponsor. So they could offer these enormous purses. So of course, everybody wanted a piece of the action. And so did the drivers. So every driver showed up. It was like Mario Andretti and Dan Gurney and George Fulmer and Jackie Stewart and Peter Brevson. It goes on and on and on. So the fans showed up. The fans showed up to see their favorite Formula One drivers would come there, NASCAR, Trans Am. These guys could all move between series pretty easily back in the day, and they came there for the big purses. So you're out there watching these crazy cars, and every one of them different. And these fantastic drivers all going head to head. You know, can you imagine seeing the greatest Formula One drivers racing, Trans Am drivers at the same time? Like, it was just amazing. I can go on and on about the Can-Am. So you can understand why Porsche wanted a piece of this action. And they came in early. The few guys raced the 908, which was the Spider version of the 908, with flat 8-cylinder they had. And it was underpowered. It was like 350 horsepower compared to what the Chevy V8s were putting out. And the Chevy V8s, and there were a few Fords, but mostly Chevy V8s. And they were putting out, at the beginning, 650 horsepower. They'd work their way up to the 800 horsepower out of these things, and up to like 503 cubic inches out of the original 427s. So they were monsters, and Porsche didn't have the motor until the 917 came along. Now, the 917 main purpose was to win Le Mans in coupe style, but they did build the 917 PA, which was a Spider version. Joe Siffert drove that, and that car actually helped develop the 917K coupe but that's the subject of another video. So they had been dabbling in it to see what was going on. And you'll also see in some of the 1970 Can-Am, you'll see the Gulf 917Ks out racing in the Can-Am. And what that was that the endurance cars would race on Saturday and the Can-Am would be on Sunday. So if the car survived the Saturday race, didn't really cost any much more money to jump into the Can-Am race on Sunday and get a piece of that giant purse and get some publicity out of it. Now, they never won anything, but they were feeling out what Porsche could do in that series. So the 917, 917K, the LH, they were going to be relegated out of existence after 1971, and Porsche knew that they wanted to continue this using this amazing platform, this 12-cylinder engine that they had developed, the amazing brakes. And the logical thing to do was to move into Can-Am full-time. So their plan was to build a new car around the structure of the 917 called the 917-10. Now, this was going to be purely built from the ground up as a Can-Am car. Now, everybody thinks of 1972 being the first year of the 917-10, but actually it raced in 1971. Joe Sifford drove it and actually came in fourth in the championship. He would unfortunately die later that year in a crash. But the 917-10 ran unturbocharged before its amazing debut in 1972. Now, what happened in 1972 was instead of being this kind of semi-privateer effort by Sifford, it was a fully professional, team-backed, factory-backed effort that was handed off to the Penske organization. Now, it's interesting because Penske was racing the Ferraris against Porsche in the Endurance Series in 1771, but they had such a fantastic organization that Porsche approached them and asked them to run this basically American racing series and for their American efforts. Now, Penske came with the best secret weapon ever, well, not so secret, in the form of Mark Donohue. Mark Donohue is probably one of the greatest racer engineers of all time. And he would take cars, like he took the Ferrari 512, which wasn't a great car at the beginning, but under the scrutiny of Penske and the driving of Donohue, that car got better and better and better quickly, getting closer to the 917s. Never had a chance to really get to the pinnacle, but it was an amazing car when they were done. So Porsche had a feeling that they could hand this off to Penske and let them help develop it, which they did. So in 71, Donohue goes over to Europe and sees what they have. Now, they've been running this car for over a year, and Willy Kossen was the German driver who was helping develop it. He put 1,000 miles on this thing by then. Not turbocharged, but the chassis alone. Donohue comes over, and in his book, if you ever get a chance to read The Unfair Advantage by Mark Donohue, he talks all about the development of this car, and quite modestly talks about how he went in and fixed everything that Porsche had done wrong. And they really, I don't think they understood the series as well as he understood what was happening, but he knew that this was going to be the package to win in 72. He spent a lot of time in Europe and pretty much destroyed his marriage trying to get this car where it was. And it was an amazing Herculean effort. And what they did was they developed probably the next level of a car. Cars kind of evolve slowly over time. And sometimes there's this quantum leap. Well, that's what happened when they went to the 917-10. It was the turbocharging that changed everything. But Porsche didn't really understand it. And neither did Bosch, who was putting the whole thing together. This, again, was kind of the Wild West. They were like, let's put some turbochargers on this 12 and see what happens, except in a German accent. And the result was an undrivable car. Donohue talks about that once they'd figured out the suspension, fixed a lot of things with that, that the engine itself would only run at full throttle. And he's like, well, that's no good. in a road race, on Indy, that'd be fine, right? But on a road race course, it's got to go up and down in speed all the time. You need fractions of throttle to make it work. And it wouldn't even idle when they got a hold of it with the turbochargers. So Donohue went back to scratch. They took the turbochargers off completely and found what the engine needed to run as a baseline. Then they put on the turbochargers and worked their way through degrees and created what was really one of the first fuel maps for turbocharging at the time. And they kind of rammed it down the throat of Bosch, and together they came up with a fuel map. Now, nowadays turbocharged cars in your car, that has increments of degrees of change to the fuel map. This was like every few degrees, or every 5 degrees, you'd have a change, but at least it made it drivable. And once they had figured that out, they kind of unleashed the power of this engine. Now, we got to talk about the power. Everybody talks about these cars made 3,000 horsepower, some crazy numbers. There are some crazy numbers that go with it, and some of them are legit. You have to remember, but back in the day, they didn't have the dynos we had today. In fact, they talk about burning out Porsche's dyno once they got over 800 horsepower out of this thing. And most of it, as you go over 1,000 horsepower, wasn't really based on a dyno spinning. It was based on the math. Like if you increase bar by the pressure inside the turbos by a certain amount, you should get this much more. So here's some numbers for you for the 91710. As best as I can find, that actually was written down instead of made up. 0 to 60, 2.1 seconds. 0 to 100, 3.9 seconds. 0 to 200 miles an hour in 13.4 seconds. That's in less than a half a mile. This is a 5-liter flat 12 twin turbocharged. Now, those are stellar numbers. Now, it's the horsepower everybody always talks about. The 5-liter 91710, according on paper, was put at maximum boost at about 1,100 horsepower. Now, they didn't race it at 1,100 horsepower, and also the driver didn't have control of it. It was preset. So later in the 91730, you'll see a knob on the dash, and that was revolutionary. And I think actually Rensler did it before Porsche to put the knob on the dash so they can adjust the boost as they drove. But the 91710 was fixed, so they would, qualifying, sure, throw everything at it. 1,100 horsepower, crush everything. Then they dial it back to just around 900 horsepower, 880, 900 horsepower for the race, which was still 100 horsepower more than what the Chevy V8s were putting out. And it was reliable and ran. So those are kind of the numbers I found. There's always going to be an argument. Nobody's back in the day. We don't have a time machine to go back and find out. But Canepa, where I worked, did rebuild a lot of these engines. I got to talk to some of the engine builders and got the skinny on what the power, realistic power was. And we'll go into more detail on that with the 91730 because those numbers are cuckoo pants. All right, so now they've got a tremendous car, and they decided they'd come back to the United States to go racing. And Donahue's like, I've got the car to win it all. Hands down, this car is going to just mop up everything. We can even dial things back. We'll have McLaren by the shorts. Now, remember, McLaren won the Can-Am in 67, 68, 69, 70, and 71. They won 5 years on the trot. They called it the Bruce and Denny show. And it was Bruce McLaren driving, and then it was Denny Hume. They would go back and forth of who would win the championship. And everybody calls the 91730 the Can-Am killer because it was so dominant. And I always kind of question that, and I'll talk more about that later. But, why didn't 5 years of McLaren winning scare everybody away? It didn't. So Porsche came up. They're faster than the McLarens. That's really who's the person to beat. Shadow's kind of in the mix there because they're developing their cars pretty quickly. And Lola kind of ish, but they had Jackie Stewart driving, which who couldn't win without Jackie Stewart? The Porsche effort was meticulous, and it was meticulous because Penske was meticulous and because Porsche was meticulous. They showed up with this perfect car. They were going to win everything. So now it's time for them to take it to its first race at Mosport. And Donahue had literally, I think 2 weeks earlier, won the Indianapolis 500. So he's on top of the world. He's got that. Now he's got the best Can-Am car. And he kind of goes out a little strong in practice and ends up going like 3 seconds faster than the track record right off the shot. Good job keeping the lid on things there, right? So everybody's going berserk. They get it out in the race. a valve sticks. Of course, this is completely right. This is not a proven car yet. And they come back in, Donahue gets out of the car. He's like, it's not going to work. They're like, get back in the car and score some points. So they get him back in the car. He still ends up coming in second place after being out of the car for 3 laps. Now, he didn't want that to happen again the second race at Atlanta. And this is when things go sideways. This car he had poured his heart and life into. They took it out for some practice. They had 2 cars. They had a backup car as well. And they were working on one car. He takes the other car out to go warm it up. And the story I heard was that, you would hear him go out and they're like, just take it easy, just warm it up. Usually one of the crew would take the car around and warm up the oil. And they take it around. They hear, then it goes a little faster. Boom. And then silence. What had happened was somebody forgot to put a couple of the pins in the rear bodywork. And Mark had taken it down the back straightaway, got up a little bit of speed, and it peeled off. And the car lifted up in the air and eventually just cartwheeled. And there was so little left of this car. It was literally a seat, a couple of bars, and an engine. That was it. And this is kind of the same accident that had killed Bruce McLaren in 1970. And when they came around the corner to see what was left of Mark, his leg was busted up, but he was alive. He was so lucky to have survived it. And that was the end of him being able to race the car, at least for the next few months. They took him to the hospital. They got him stitched up. But they're at Atlanta, ready to go racing. What do? They tap the shoulder of George Fulmer to race the car. Now, George Fulmer's had nothing to do with the development of the car. He's never driven the car before, never driven a turbocharged monster like this before. Donahue gives him all the advice he can. He learned to drive the car in practice, and that's it. And then he had to go race the car. Penske goes up to him, tells him, don't crash the car, win the race. No pressure, right? Well, he won the race. And he would go on to drive the car for the rest of the season. To the chagrin of Donahue, who's watching this car, it's kind of like, he said it was kind of like watching his wife in bed with another man. He just was driving him crazy. And the car had another hiccup at another race, but pretty much started dominating like crazy once they'd worked all the kinks out of it. Donahue, interestingly enough, comes back later in the season. The car that they had been running was chassis 3. That's the championship car. And I think it was chassis 5 that he came back in. And you'll see later in the season, you'll see 2 91710 cars, the L&M cars, and they are next to each other. One is number 6 and one is number 7. The beginning of the season is all number 6. That's Fulmer. But when Donahue returns, he wants his number back. So the number 6 is Donahue and the number 7 is Fulmer. So you can't track race cars by their numbers on their sides. You have to track them by their chassis numbers, which makes it a lot harder. So you can't say, the number 7 car, because that could have been 3 different cars, to tell you the truth. They end up winning the championship. Fulmer has twice as many points as the second place. The car's utterly dominant. Everybody wants one. Porsche's go like, heck yeah, we'll sell you some 91710s. So finally, Vashik gets his, Brumos gets theirs. And there's another sideshow going on here that a lot of Americans don't know about, that there was a race series called the Inner Series in Europe, and it was their version of the Can-Am. And they had early restrictions on non-turbocharged 4.5 liter, but it was still a 91710. So there were non-turbocharged 91710s. They weren't all turbocharged. They actually won the Can-Am in 1972 and the Inner Series in 1972, driven by Leo Kununen. So it was the car to have. Other things that happened, which I thought were interesting, I got to talk to Woody Woodson, who was one of the crew chiefs, and he said that the tires kept getting bigger. They wanted bigger, wider, and wider tires for the back, essentially almost dragster tires. They start off with a 17-inch wheel. And when I say 17 inches, I don't mean the diameter like we talk about today, that thing's rolling on 20s. No, I'm talking about the width. So they were 17 inches wide, and they eventually got to 19 inches wide when Goodyear started making wide enough rubber. When they started, there just wasn't a wide enough tire. he said that every race they would come with a wider tire, so they'd make a wider wheel. And eventually, it started interfering with the swing arms. And at the 9/17/10/03, you can see there's points of the chassis where they literally cut the swing arm mounting points off and moved them so they didn't touch the wheel. And I asked him, I said, did you sit there overnight with your slide rule figuring out the angles, the rear suspension? And he said, no, we just put it where it fit. I can't even imagine that happening nowadays. But they just said, well, it swung this far and didn't touch the wheel here. We welded it to the chassis there. I'm sure they figured that all out later. But that is always astounding. Because just to give you an idea what the teams were like, nowadays, there's trucks and trucks and trucks for each team, big rigs and all kinds of equipment and people. Back then, there was one truck, there was a Penske truck, and two cars. And they kind of sat in them, piggybacked on each other, and a spare motor. And that was it. And 4 or 5 guys. And they'd come into town, and they'd hire some guys to help out with the pit crew. But Woody and his guys, they would just they would take care of what needed to be done. And there's pictures of this thing. They weren't formal paddocks. They're parked in the grass. And there's a little crane that comes out the back of the truck holding a new motor, and they're kind of tinkering there on these amazing cars. Nothing like it is today. So it was the car to have. All the other teams now are scrambling. You can imagine. They're like, oh no, what? Turbocharging. They had gotten as much as they could out of these big Chevy engines. There wasn't much more to have. You could push them a little bit more, but then you had to kind of work against the reliability of the motor. Now, 73 is an interesting year, and there's a huge transition that happens. McLaren drops out of the Can-Am, and they wanted to focus on Indianapolis, and they wanted to focus on Formula One. Can-Am, they had kind of proven that they were great at it. They had won it 5 times. And also, they tried to build a turbocharged car. There's not a lot of talk about that, but they tried it. They put turbos on a Chevy V8. So did Shadow. And Shadow had some issues with it. Wasn't really working, and they couldn't get the cooling right. Now remember, they didn't know about intercoolers at the time, so they're running this hot air right into the engine, and it didn't work terribly well. What McLaren's issue was they couldn't get the power. They built an 1,100 horsepower V8 with the turbos on it, but it was the transmission that was the issue. It's kind of funny to think about it, but you can take a little bit of the glory away from the beautiful 12-cylinder twin turbo and talk about Porsche's 920 transmission. It was a 4-speed transmission in that, and Donahue told him to take reverse gear out of it. He says, Mr. Penske doesn't pay me to drive in reverse, because he wanted to make it lighter, and they wanted to make the gears more robust. And that transmission could handle the power that were coming out of these monster engines. But unfortunately, McLaren couldn't get that equation together. They kept blowing up transmissions. They're like, this isn't worth the time and money and effort. We're done with this. And so kind of the transmission helped win these races. And also the transmissions, by the way, transmissions have what are called differentials in them. Well, the transaxles do. And that allows 2 wheels to turn kind of independently. When you go around a corner, one tire's got to turn farther than the other. And what they did with the 9/17/10 and the 30 is they did what's called a spool. There's no real differential. Those 2 tires are locked together. They only move in unison. When that car turns, and when we were pushing the 9/17/10 and 30 around the paddock, it's difficult. As soon as you turn it, one tire starts going chop, 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 starts hopping around. And that's because it can't turn at a different speed than the inside wheel. So that's how they got all that power. It made the 9/17/10 basically a dragster. There's the guys who drove it. Hurley Haywood talks about how flexy the chassis was, and how you had to keep one foot. You had to learn how to 2-foot drive it. You had to put your foot on the brake and on the gas at the same time to keep the boost up. Otherwise, it would come up all at once. And you had to kind of go in, rotate the car, build the boost. So you basically had to have 3 feet, right? So you're kind of shifting gears, building the boost, holding the brake, coming around, and then you kind of release the rocket as you hopefully had rotated the car just in the right direction, and boom, all that power would hit, and you take off down the straightaway. In 917-10, one of the thing was it was a twitchy car to drive. It had a shorter wheelbase. That was addressed in the 917-30. There's a famous quote by Mark Donohue, and I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong, because it's always kind of paraphrased. And he talked to the German engineers when they were developing the car, and he says, "It will never have enough power until I can spin the wheels at the end of the straightaway in high gear." And that's the kind of power he wanted. And you can imagine the German engineers being very little, going, "Well, that is not very efficient, because if the wheels are spinning and you are laying black stripes, then you are not putting the energy to the ground and you're not going forward." And you can just see Donohue going, "Oh boy." So that's the kind of power he wanted. So when going into 1973, that's what he got. The 917-10s had been sold off to privateers. In fact, the two cars that ran for Penske got sold to Renzler, and they had R.C. Cola, and George Fulmer was driving one of those. For Penske, it was just Donohue in the 917-30. Now, the 917-30 is another step up. And here's we start talking about the car that killed Can-Am. Could anybody compete with it? Well, you know, they keep saying like, oh, a manufacturer came to Can-Am and, you know, destroyed all these independent teams. Well, Porsche wasn't a huge company. It wasn't like Ford throwing millions at Le Mans. You know, Porsche had to do things in degrees to stay afloat. And granted, their engineering was amazing, and they had Donohue doing his thing. They built the first 917-30 chassis, had an adjustable chassis in front of the firewall so they could make it longer or shorter. And it got out in the press that they were like, it would be shorter for short tracks and longer for long tracks, but it was really just a development chassis to find what the ideal length was. And I think they only lengthened it by about 6 inches, but that was enough to stabilize the car a whole lot better than the 917-10. The engine size also increased to 5.4 liters, and that was a step up in power, as you can imagine. Now, let's talk about the 917-30, had 1 million horsepower. So the 917-30, there's talk of it having 1,500 horsepower. Is that true? Yes, that is true. That engine was capable of making what the math that we did up to 1,560 horsepower. You'll see 1,580 thrown around. But according to, you know, how much power it was making, adding pressure and fuel, it came up to 1,560. Was it dyno to that? No. The low end was like 1,100 horsepower. What the car ran as is that they wanted to qualify. Yeah, they could turn the wick up. And again, this came to a point where the driver could adjust the boost. They could run 1,500 horsepower in qualifying, which really wasn't necessary because the V8s were putting anything close to that. But in race trim, they could back it down to 1,100 horsepower, which was the top end of the 917-10. 917-10 wouldn't be running that. So they knew they had like a 200 horsepower gap. And you're talking about a car. Now, the McLarens weighed, you know, they weighed 1,700 pounds. The 917-10s weighed in high 1,700s. They started working their way into 1,800. The 917-30 was in the 1,800s because it was just getting bigger. They added much larger fuel tanks because Can-Am required you to carry all of your fuel for the entire race. These were sprint races. And so 200 miles, you had to carry all of it. And 917-10 got like 3.5 miles a gallon. 917-30 got somewhere 2 point something miles a gallon. So they were carrying 2 huge fuel tanks. If you ever get to see the car naked, there are 2 enormous fuel tanks on either side of you. Call it crash protection. So these huge tanks, in the 917-30, I think there were 44 gallons each on either side of you. You had this giant engine in back of you, and you had nothing in front of your feet except for some little tiny aluminum bars. Oh, by the way, chassis was made out of aluminum tubing. There's a lot of talk about these cars were made out of magnesium. Yes, there were a couple of magnesium frames made. So there were a couple of magnesium of 917-10s. I think chassis 10 and 11 were magnesium. One was destroyed. I think Donohue crashed the other one. But for the most part, the winning cars was chassis 3 in 72 and chassis 3 in 73. They were aluminum chassis cars. So, and like the 917-10 was like 110 pounds stripped down naked, and the 917-30 was closer to like 140 pounds. I lifted these things up when they were at the shop at Canapa, and it's shocking. You think about 1,000, 1,500 horsepower going through these spindly little frames, where the other teams had beautiful, state-of-the-art aluminum monocoque chassis, which made them lighter and stronger, but still. Ugh. I can't even imagine. I've sat in those cars, and it's just scary sitting in them. The stones on the drivers, on Fulmer and Donahue to drive these, just amazing. So the 917-30, it essentially wins every race it finishes. It's untouchable. And in fact, I believe at Riverside it lapped second place. That would have been a 917-10. All right. So it was staggeringly fast. So here's the argument. It was so dominant, it was so amazing that it killed the series, that nobody wanted to compete. I have some argument against that. All right, granted, it was an amazing car. Shadow was that year building a turbo V8, and they were trying to make that work. There were other teams trying to figure out a way to come after Porsche. And given time, they probably could have. But what happened in 73, 74 was you had Johnson Wax, their big sponsor who brought all the money and the big prizes, stopped sponsoring them. So they couldn't offer these enormous purses. And Formula One, at the same time, got a big sponsor, a tobacco company, and they started offering larger purses, drawing the drivers away from Can-Am. Then you had a war in the Middle East. You had oil embargo, so there was fuel shortages in the United States. In 1974, they canceled the 12 hours of Sebring. They canceled the 24 hours of Daytona. Like, just to have a racing series at the time. People today don't understand what it was like during the oil crisis then. So the SCCA was kind of out of their depth in promoting the series. They had lost all of this mojo. And so they were like, okay, we're going to put a restriction on the cars. And that's what kills a series. It started dying in my mind in 1970 when they made the sucker car illegal. Started fussing with rules instead of letting it continue being a free-for-all. So they would put a restriction on the fuel, so this 917-30 getting 2-point-something miles a gallon had to get above 3 miles a gallon. And it kind of took the turbos away. They ran one race with Brian Redman, and I believe it lost to the Shadow. Now, Shadow, in 74, had figured it out. And it would have been cool to see the Turbo against the Shadow, because what Shadow had done, up to that point, they had all these wackadoodle ideas. They had the V8 go-kart, and they had tiny wheels, and they tried all kinds of zany things. They finally said, let's take our Formula One car, cut it in half, and make it a two-seater and put a body on it. So essentially, it was their Formula One car as a Can-Am car with 2 seats. And it was lighter, and it was faster, and it was really quick. And it could have been a competitor for the 917-30, even with the turbos, but we never got to see that. Everything collapsed, and they shut down the series after the 6th race, and Shadow won the 1974 championship. IMSA, the other racing series that John Bishop started rising up against the SCCA. Can-Am was in trouble anyway. The 917-30, helped put a nail in that coffin, but it didn't kill a racing series all by itself. There's always more elements. There's always gray area. That being said, what a car. And I was so fortunate to be there at Canapa when we worked on the 917-10, and we got to work on the 917-30. Bruce brokered a deal to bring the Chassis 3 back to the United States to be sold to an American owner, and it got restored, and it's being driven these days. So if you get to go to some of the historics, you get to go to Rennsport, you get to see the real car. Just as a side note, there were 6 chassis made for the 917-30. 1, 2, and 3 were the 1973 chassis. 4, 5, and 6 were supposed to be for the 74 season, which never happened. And those were sold to independent guys. There was one to Australia. And over the years, they got painted to look like the Sunoco car. And it became very confusing, at Goodwood or at other events. And you'd see the Sunoco car, but it wasn't the championship car. It just looked like it. It still had all the 917-30 bits, but it wasn't that car. That car, Chassis 3, is now running. Chassis 4 was one of the clones. It was owned by Jerry Seinfeld for a while. And Canepa agreed to help restore that car if it could be put back to its delivery white. So you'll see that 91730. It is white now, like it would have been delivered from the factory, with the number 4 on it for Chassis 4. So you get to now see and listen to and embrace the amazingness of these two cars at historic racing. And I so support you to go out to an historic event, whether or not they have these cars, go to one. But if they are available, if they are there, to hear the whoosh of those turbos, to see the speed in which they moved. The 91730, in its first race, it had an accident. And the reason for the accident was, and it's amazing, was its closing speed. So the closing speed is when a car's running and a faster car is coming up on them, how fast they can close the distance between them. The 91730, none of those drivers had ever seen a car close that fast. And the back markers were going, and he's already ready to lap. After a few laps, he's ready to lap backside, right? So this back marker, this poor guy, you can imagine, like, you're used to looking in the mirror, right? And looking back at the road, getting your bearings, looking back in the mirror, and it's getting closer, and look back at the road. But in this case, you look back in the mirror, and you look forward, and the car's next to you. Like, they essentially, he went right, Donahue went right, he went left, and Donahue went off the road because this back marker was like, what? There was a missile coming up on me. And that was the speed of the 91730. You get to see that in real life, like shooting down the straight at Laguna Seca or wherever it might show up. Highly recommend seeing it. Oh, and just another little geek thing you'll see in the 91730 was one of the first uses of wheel fans. And I did an article for 000 magazine on these. And the wheels were so deep, they were 19 inches deep at that point. Getting air into the brakes was vicious. So they used these wheel fans on the outside to suck air through the wheel because it's a radial fan. So it sucks air from the center and expels it out this way. And it would create a vacuum inside the wheel and pull it out. You'll see that. I'll do a video on wheel fans at some point. But that's one of the first uses you'll see of wheel fans, just to get air and cool those brakes inside of those enormous wheels. Now, the competitive life for the 91730 came to an end in 1974, but that wasn't the end of the car. They put it aside, and in 1975, they're like, hey, just for fun, let's go set the closed course speed record in this thing. So they get a sponsor from Cam2. They put what they call the Cam2 body on it. It's slightly more aerodynamic. It closes off the passenger side of the car, still open cockpit, and they go to Talladega. And interestingly enough, they don't use the 5.4 liter engine. They go back to the 5 liter engine, which they can take up to a higher rev range. And they add, which is most important to that car, intercoolers for the first time. So it never raced in season with the intercoolers. The intercoolers were added for the speed run. And that allowed the 5 liter engine to have as much power as the 5.4 liter engine. So they were up in that 1,500 horsepower range for a few laps. And that car set the closed course speed record at 221 miles an hour. And that means on the straights, he's probably going well close to 240 miles an hour, which is staggering for a car with an open cockpit. Donahue wrote how terrifying the experience was. And then when he got done with it, he was like, yep, don't ever need to do that again. Never have to do that again. Unfortunately, he would never have to do that again because he'd pass away in an accident about 10 days later. But that one of his last great accomplishments was setting that closed course speed record, which stood for years afterwards. The real end of the 917 really is the beginning of the 936, which was the next endurance car. They took the 917 chassis, the brakes, the whole concept of the 917. They put a turbocharger. They brought the turbochargers idea from the Can-Am cars and turbocharged a 6 and put it in the back of the 936, which became a dominant endurance car. So the technology lived on, but that car finished its life in 1975. And what a life it had. So thanks for watching. If you got this far, please like and subscribe. I'm going to play that video right after I'm finished talking with you. But I'll be doing more history stuff as we move on. And I'll also, of course, be doing stuff in the garage. Please add comments. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you didn't like. Tell me what you'd like to see. I'm listening. I'm watching. I'm reading. I will add to it. We'll do more of this coming up. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you got your geek on. Have a great day.